and welcome to the latest edition of the Deutsche Breeding Project and our book discussion. And I'm so happy to be here tonight with you. I'm your host, James Edward Mills, and I'm pleased to introduce to you this month's author, Leah Penniman. Now, before we get started, I want to make sure that we begin the conversation about her book, Black Earth Wisdom, Soulful Conversations with Black Environmentalists. I want to make sure that we first acknowledge that I'm screening in tonight from Madison, Wisconsin, which is the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk people, which is a place they called for time immemorial as they joke. So please, wherever you are in North or South America, take a moment to recognize the Native people who once called the place where you now live home. And I'd also like to thank the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for their support for this and other online discussions hosted by the Deutsche Project, as well as the financial contributions of the Schleck Family Foundation, the National Geographic Society, and the National Park Service, who provide us with funds so that we can pay our speakers every month a small stipend. It's modest, but I sincerely believe that friends should never let friends work for free. So thank you. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the Deutsche Project, I'm a freelance journalist and independent media producer, and I have a specialty in outdoor recreation and environmental conservation. And I have a further specialty in covering issues of racial diversity, equity, and inclusion in access to natural resources and our public land. And at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I teach an undergraduate course called Outdoors for All at the Nelson Institute. And many of the titles that we are discussing in our book group are on my students' reading list. And this, frankly, is a really great opportunity for the general public and non-students to learn a little bit about the experiences of people of color and our relationship with the natural world, and hopefully share a lot of wisdom through memoir and academic research. Now, our guest tonight, Leah Penniman, is a Black Kreyol farmer, mother, soul nerd, author, and food justice advocate from Soul Fire Farm in Grafton, New York. She co-founded Soul Fire Farm in 2010 with a mission to end racism in the food system and reclaim our ancestral connection with the land. As co-ED or executive director and farm director, Leah is part of a team that facilitates powerful food sovereignty programs, including farmer training for Black and Brown people, a subsidized farm food distribution program for communities living under food apartheid, and domestic and international organizing toward equity in the food system. So without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to my good friend, Leah Penniman. Leah, how are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I've long admired your podcast and, aspired to be part of it. So thank you for this opportunity.
Awesome. Well, that means everything to me. So thank you so much for being here this evening. And I'm assuming, because I'm looking at your lovely loft home, you're at the Soul Fire Farm in New York right now.
I sure am. So Soul Fire Farm is in unceded Mohican territory, also known as Grafton, New York, up here in the mountains. And we're on 80 acres of land that we steward using our ancestral practices. And this home is one that we built by hand using all local materials. It's a straw bale, timber frame, passive solar, eco house that we put together in our early 20s. My wonderful spouse is a skilled builder, and I'm so grateful to live in this home.
That's wonderful. And I think that's actually a really good place to start, because now you actually have a pretty extensive background. As I understand from your book, you started farming in 1996. And I'm wondering if you can first give us a little bit about your background. I mean, where are you originally from and what was your life like growing up?
Well, thank you for that. I know I'm dating myself because anyone who starts their career in 96 is no spring chicken, but I grew up mostly in a tiny rural town in central Massachusetts. It was a predominantly white town. Our family was, for most of my childhood, the only family of color. And because of that, the racialized brutality that we experienced in school drove us to nature. The three of us siblings spent a whole lot of time in the woods and developed this close, intimate relationship with the earth as mother. When we first learned about global warming and species extinction, it set off alarm bells in our tiny hearts. And we formed an ecology club by age 6, and we're stopping loggers and picking up trash and, convincing people to save water. And this care for the earth is what propelled me in my teenage years to seek out a job tending the earth. And there was a flyer at church that my mom picked up for the food project. The food project grows youth and food in the Boston area. And I was fortunate enough to get that job and just completely fell in love with the elegant simplicity of rowing a hoe and the undeniable goodness of pulling carrots from the earth and feeding them to people who need them in Dorchester and Roxbury. So I was hooked, and I farmed every season since then. Many Hands Organic Farm school internationally in Ghana and Mexico and Haiti. I had a parallel career as a high school environmental science teacher and got my kids outside, as much as possible as well. So it wasn't entirely segregated. But as far as Soul Fire Farm itself, that came further down the road when my spouse, Joan, and I were living in the south end of Albany, a neighborhood under food apartheid. And we were struggling to get fresh food for our family. There were no supermarkets, farmers markets, community garden plots, bus lines to get to the supermarket. So when our neighbors found out that we knew how to farm, they started encouraging us, let's say, to start a farm for the people. And that was the catalyst for creating a farm whose first program would actually be to bring food to the South End and to other neighborhoods under food apartheid, so that we can honor the fact that food is a basic human right and not a privilege reserved for the lucky few.
Now, that's a term that I think a lot of people might not necessarily apply to something like food accessibility. What do you mean when you say food apartheid?
Thank you for asking that. So I need to credit my mentor, Karen Washington, who's a Black farmer who started the Black Urban Growers and also is at Rise and Root Farm. And she was very annoyed by the fact that the government calls so many of our neighborhoods food deserts, because a desert implies something natural. Those of ecologists, desert is beautiful. It is it's part of the biosphere and it belongs. And there's nothing natural about your zip code being the leading determiner of your life expectancy, and the very same neighborhoods that were redlined under racist housing policies being the neighborhoods where you can't get fresh food. And by the way, you also can't get a decent education or breathe clean air or avoid incarceration and on and on. And so apartheid refers to a system of segregation that people create based on race, which is exactly what we have. And, it might sound like a dramatic term, but it's really a hopeful term, because anything that people create, people can undo. Something that Mother Earth creates, that's a different thing. So when we call it food apartheid, we're acknowledging that, this is systemic and we have work to do to make sure that everyone has food and access to green space and all of these basic human rights that studies have shown time and again are necessary for human thrival.
Okay, I'm going to start using food apartheid and stop using food deserts. I love the notion of recognizing the difference between a desert, which is naturally occurring, and something like apartheid, which is put in place through human and social political policies. That's a wonderful way to look at this. And clearly, you have a very profound appreciation for nature, for the properties of what I'm just going to call soil, seed, sunlight, and water. So at what point did you decide that you're going to start formally writing about these things that you're passionate about? When did you decide that you're actually going to become an educator of these things as well as a practitioner?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I've been a high school science teacher. So I've been an educator almost accidentally. I figured why not get this free 5th-year master's degree in education while I'm already in school anyway? It's a nice back pocket thing. And then I got recruited to start the AP environmental science program at the local public school. I thought, oh, how cool is that? And then I realized, what is more fun than playing outside in, counting macroinvertebrates with young people or taking soil course? Like that's the coolest thing ever. So 17 years later, there I was, still a teacher. But as far as turning the education in person into the education via the written word, in some ways that was also accidental. Soul Fire Farm, when we started out, we're a family farm. We didn't have any staff. So, we're all wearing a lot of hats, and someone had to write the newsletter. So for a period of time, I was writing the newsletter. It is fun, be poetic and describe the magic of what's happening on the land. And an editor at Yes Magazine was following our newsletter and hit me up one day and said, would you like to turn some of these posts into articles? And I said, sure, that'd be fun, you know? So a few articles later about our programs, a publishing company, Chelsea Green at the time, reached out and said, would you like to turn all these articles into a book? So, you know, writing found me in that way. And I recognize the privilege of that, because I know a lot of times you're banging down the doors of a publisher to let you in. But I had the blessing of having some latitude to take the immense, just the immense amount of information and learning we had done at Soulfire Farm and turn it into Farming While Black, which was my 2018 book. It's basically our curriculum, you know, put into a book. The history of noble Black agrarianism, you know, how to farm, how to dismantle an racist food system, you know, that's all in there. And then Black Earth Wisdom was born out of, I'll tell you this one quick story, this very special piece of research that I found researching for Farming While Black about George Washington Carver. So many folks know George Washington Carver for the peanut, right? Any Black History Month elementary school display is going to have him with a peanut next to it, because he made thousands of inventions with the peanut, which incidentally he refused to patent because he believed in the commons. But the reason he was so into peanuts is because they're legumes. And legumes have that magical capacity to partner with bacteria and pull nitrogen out of the sky and into the soil, where it heals the soils broken under monocropping from chattel slavery. And he was the godfather of the modern organic movement. In the 1800s, he was figuring out how to scale organic practices. And perhaps the most special thing about this was that when his friend Glenn Clark asked him, where did you get these ideas? Because no one's doing this around you. He said, oh, I go into the forest in the pre-dawn hours and I listen to God through the trees. He said, nature is God's unlimited broadcasting system through which he speaks to me every minute, every hour, every day, if I just tune to the right channel. So here's this scientist who has this spiritual connection with nature to inform his directionality. And it got me thinking about how we also need to talk about what are the spiritual, philosophical, and worldview components that go along with right action in relation to the environment, right? Because it's not, we don't, I mean, you and I at least, right? We're not taking care of the environment because we're doing some calculus about personal benefit. We have an idea about the intrinsic value of nature, our kinship with nature. And so I got very curious about Black thinkers, past and present, who have this worldview and weaving those voices together into a book.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, and truthfully, I really love the connection with someone like George Washington Carver, you know, because his is a narrative that, again, we hear all about through Black history, but only so far. You know, we only hear about, you know, the peanut, but we don't know or not taught exactly what that means. But I would imagine that through the course of all of your work, when you started Soulfire Farm in 2010, that you also had some challenges. And I'm curious to know, you know, when you're talking about not just growing food, but educating your community on the importance of creating sustainable ecosystems and building relationships between people and the earth. What were some of the initial challenges that you had just getting started, you know, getting the farm up and running? And what can you tell us about what your plans are for the future?
Oh, so many challenges. Where do we even start? Well, let me contextualize it historically a little bit. Right? So Black folks don't really have much lands. You know, 98% of the agricultural land in this country is white owned. And that is not by accident, and it's not by the choice of our community. There has been a deliberate project originally under Manifest Destiny to dispossess Indigenous people of almost the entire continent. And then at the end of chattel slavery in 1865, you know, 40 acres and a mule was promised, but then it was quickly rescinded. In fact, it were the white so-called masters that got reparations, right, for their quote lost property. And so, you know, I was so moved when I learned that, you know, in 1865, the freed people of Falls Church, Virginia, wrote a letter to the Freedmen's Commission saying, what we need are homes and the lands beneath them that we may plant fruit trees concerning which our children can say these are ours. And this yearning for land And planting trees and having a firm place to put our homes has been enduring in the Black community. I mean, by 1910, Black folks managed to purchase 16 million acres of hard scrabble, tiny plots of land, but it was theirs. And then the Klan came, and the Whitecaps and the White Citizens Council, and burned down their homes. It was Red Summer, pushed them off their land, stole their land. This has been well documented by the Equal Justice Initiative. We know the names of 4,000 people who lost their lives. And that was the push factor for the Great Migration. 6 million Black people moving to the urban north from the red clays of Georgia. But that yearning for land never left. It lived on in Hattie Carthen's gardens. It lived on in Rufus and Demalda Newsom's urban gardens. And it lived on in my own grandmother's strawberry patch in her Boston backyard. And we like to think of ourselves as the rising and returning generation. There are people lined up around the block to get into Soul Fire Farms programs, Black and Brown, Indigenous, Latina people who are saying, it's understandable that our grandparents and great-grandparents left because the land was the scene of the crime, but the land was never the criminal. The land was never the criminal. And in fact, the land is where we need to plant fruit trees so we can tell our children, like, you belong and something is yours. Harriet Tubman's #1 freedom dream was to plant an orchard. And that's what she did when she got up to New York, is she planted an orchard. It still lives today. And so the hardship is that the structural machine is against, Black and Brown farmers having access to things. If you don't have money, if you didn't inherit something, where are you going to get land? How are you going to afford land, right? And so, to contextualize our own struggles, we could only afford, even with borrowing from friends and family, we could only afford, a rocky mountainside. And so the amount of labor that has to go into growing anything on this land, and the ways that we can't mechanize. And so the impact on the labor that we all hold is immense. The distance from markets, the distance from public transportation. So that extra work that has to go in is one of those struggles. And then, similarly, Black and Brown communities have been excluded from access to capital. We were denied a bank loan, from Jump. The USDA told us your land's not good enough to grow on, so you don't qualify for XYZ program. And certainly our struggles are minuscule compared to the Black farmers in the South who have been fighting the USDA for decades, but we got a little taste of it. And so the access to capital, the access to training, the access to the technical assistance, all of that wasn't there. So it was a very DIY process. And it took it's taken its toll. I mean, we're still here and we're happy, but there's a lot of kind of burnout along the way, and sacrifice along the way to be able to keep going when you don't have the generational wealth and the resources to back you up.
And on top of that, just the difficulties of farming.
Oh yeah, farming's anyway.
Right.
Well, I'll tell you this one thing, like climate change for us as farmers is not like something theoretical that we see on the news. It's personal. Like last year we had the worst drought in a decade, and I would wake up in the middle of the night, and I tell you, James, it was like I could hear the plants screaming out in thirst. I would like get up in the night and just be like tortured by these plants that were struggling, because the forecast would promise and then it would rescind, and it would promise and it would rescind. And then the year before was the flooding and the invasive species. Right. And so all of the ways that there's disruption in ecology is very personal for us. This is our fam, like all these plants and animals that we care for, and they're not, they can't handle the vagaries of climatic extreme weather events.
See, and that again, added to everything else that you're dealing with as a person of color in the agriculture business, climate change, just the randomness of the cycles of the earth, but you're still here, you're still doing. I mean, what is it that keeps you motivated? What is it that makes you, get up with the silence of the corn, if we can put it that way, after it's been screaming for out of thirst? I mean, what keeps you going?
Oh, and I realized I didn't answer your second part of your other question of what's next for Soulfire, which I'll get to. But well, what keeps me going is that I think hope is a very practical standpoint. So hear me out on this one, right? Because I have two young adult children now. And my older one is a very involved climate activist. And she asked me, like, Mom, it's not looking good. Like, how do we keep hope in the face of this? And you can't argue with the facts. And I said, well, if you just take as a thought experiment, adopting a posture of despair because in the face of all this, which is rational in some ways, then what's a logical conclusion about how you behave? And I would say with the posture of despair, I'm certainly not going to work so hard to sequester carbon in my soil, which, means that all the little creatures that are living there are going to struggle. I'm certainly not going to work so hard to make sure that those in my community are fed because, we're not going to be here anyway, right? I would adopt a sort of hedonistic, let me get mine while I can, use it up, burn it out, compete framework. And that's a harmful framework because it actually diminishes my community contribution in the present moment, not in the future promised land, but in the present moment. If I adopt a posture of hope, I'm going to keep on, I'm going to keep on doing my part around caring for all breathing things, all living things. And that's going to create benefit today and tomorrow and the next day. And, if we take the sum total of those beneficial todays, we might get to the mountaintop, we might get to the promised land. I can't tell you, I can't predict the future. But we know that if we don't do that, we most certainly will not. Right. So it's complete. It's just rationality that keeps me going.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I think it was once said by someone much wiser than me that farmers are eternal optimists. You have to be.
Well, take this, for example, our ancestral grandmothers in the Dahomey region of West Africa braided seeds into their hair, sorghum, black rice, okra, molokia, right? Braided seeds into their hair before being forced into the bowels of transatlantic slave ships because they believed against odds in a future on soil. And they believed that some descendant would exist to inherit that seed. So if they, in the face of kidnapping and chattel slavery, could take the time to braid some seeds for us, right, then who are we to be giving up? Who are we to be stopping? And so I think of us, you and I and everyone in this room as the inheritors and the guardians of the seed that needs to be passed down.
So what does the future hold for you? What do you want for Soulfire Farm a decade from now?
Well, something I love about Soulfire, the Soulfire community, and shout out to my whole team. There's 15 of us on this team now, which is amazing. Half of us are here in person on the land doing education and farming, and the other half are around the country advocating for policy change so that we have a fair system for farm workers and a fair system for Mother Earth. So shout out to all of them. I want to bring them into the space because it's truly a we. But something I love about this team is how responsive we are to what the community is asking us for and how much we try actually not to script out our own, plans on behalf of our community. We do have three main buckets of work, that we innovate within. So we're an Afro-Indigenous centered community farm committed to uprooting racism and seeding sovereignty in the food system. So our first bucket of work is we need to take care of this land. There's 80 acres of forest and fields and orchards and vegetables and bees and mushrooms. And so we are taking care of this land in a way that actually builds the soil, in a way that increases the biodiversity. And then that food and medicine is going to the people who need it most in our community. So that's foundational, right? And whether it's going to Schenectady or Albany or Troy, or whether it's going to this Black-owned grocery store or that herb shop, that can change over time. The second major bucket of work is equipping and inspiring the rising generation of Black and brown farmers. So we run classes all the time, right? It's people are here for the week-long seed to harvest immersion. We've got an 18-month fellowship that is all across the Eastern Seaboard that gives a salary and a mentor to 10 promising farmers every year. We got our, one-day workshops, our youth camp, all that kind of stuff. And again, all of that shifts depending. The community wants miso making this year, they're going to get miso making, And then our final area, which I alluded to, is the rabble rousing for systems change. That's the narrative leadership, policy work, building institutions like land trusts and co-ops. And there's a lot we do with our partners regionally and nationally, even internationally with Via Campesina and our sister farms in Haiti and Mexico and Ghana to try to make systemic change, because you can have a whole lot of trained up farmers, but if there's no land for you and no capital, and the policies are against you, you're gonna have a hard time. And just as we listen to the earth, we want to listen to our community in terms of what they're saying, like COVID, for example, farm worker community needed Spanish language COVID safety information. So that's what we did, right?
Wow. Well, I mean, everything that you're doing is, to me, part of the necessity for what can best be described as regenerative agriculture, where we are putting things into the soil that come back and give us life and give us hope. And at the end of the day, ultimately, I think can help sequester carbon and correct many of the issues that we've got in life right now, whether we're talking about energy production or housing or healthcare or whatever. I think that it all comes from the land. And that finally gets us to your book, because the whole ethos of what you brought together with this narrative is profound, because you really looking at the earth as a healer. And I think that your book might best be described as a roll call of Black environmentalists. And I love the fact you, from the very beginning, you start off taking us back to 4000 BCE with the Bantu water spirit worshippers, and which is amazing is that they're still around today. And you tell these wonderful stories from the very beginning of the book, talking about the grandmothers who braided seeds into their hair, like you were telling us about a moment ago. The thought of literally bringing plant foods of their culture on slave ships across the Middle Passage. You mentioned the poet Phyllis Wheatley in York, who traveled as part of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And of course, you mentioned Harriet Tubman, but you also talk about people like Charles Young and the Buffalo Soldiers of Yosemite, and including some people living today, like Betty Soskins, who just retired 2 years ago as the oldest living national park ranger, and my good friend, the planet walker, John Francis. Now, I think that I'm most important to ask in the very beginning of this conversation about the book is, why was it so important for you to pay homage to so many characters of the past in the very first couple of pages of the book?
Well, I'll tell you, I fought for that chapter. The publishers tried to cut it out because the price of ink and paper had gone up. And I was like, okay, reason number one, in the Black community, it is our indigenous tradition to call our ancestors when we start any gathering, right? And that includes our books. And so we pour libation and we say mojuba, we say ibashe, homage to the ancestors, because we would not be without their example, right? Without John Francis Planet Walker walking across the country in silence walking for 22 years with 17 years in silence to protest the way that fossil fuels are destroying the ecosystem, and writing the Oil Spill Act. That gives us courage. That gives us possibility, and he lives on in the body and in our as an example for us as an elder. So there's that, but there's also the fact that in the Farming While Black journey, it became so evident to me how important it is for young people to see that they are not adopting somebody else's practice when they become regenerative farmers, right? So a lot of young people come to the farm or get involved and they're very skeptical because they're like, isn't that a white people thing? Like organic, like, shouldn't I be doing something that's more, appropriate essentially to my culture? And when they learn of Dr. George Washington Carver, if they learn that Booker T. Watley came up with farm to table, they learned that the Ovambo people gave us raised beds, and the women of West Africa gave us our African dark earth compost, and on and on and on, all these examples, co-ops and land trusts came out of the Black community. It's, oh, so I belong here? I belong here. This is my lineage. These are my people. These are my stories, not borrowing somebody else's. And I think in a similar way, for this up and coming generation of aspiring environmentalists, ecologists, to see a roll call, millions, thousands of years, hundreds of years to up to present, and then all of these contemporaries that are still living and doing the work, it's like, oh, I belong here. I can just set that question aside and just get to work. I don't have to be asking, am I worthy to be in the space? And Dr. Drew Lanham put it so well, he said, nature doesn't hate. He said, no cardinal or oven bird ever paused in dawn song declaration to question the reason for my being, right? No flower closes its face to you because the color of your skin is wrong. So nature embraces us. And it's important for us to see the ways that we have been in that reciprocal relationship for our entire history.
And the poetry comes out, you know, I mean, I love what you just shared with regard to what Drew has to say about nature and its relationship to us,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and everyone is welcome to participate. And I think that in many ways, all it's really asking of us is to give back, you know, and to put into the soil exactly what it is that we want to get out, you know. And it's throughout these amazing compilations of interviews and conversations. I mean, I think you really helped us to connect with all of the, well, I refuse to believe that it's all of them, but a lot of the Black environmentalists living today. You know, I mean, and I love the fact that you connect with so many of my personal friends and people who've even been on this program, like Dr. Carolyn Finney and Drew Lanham, Latria Graham, my good friend Teresa Baker, who we'll be talking with tomorrow, Morgan Dixon, Angelou Ezelo. But you also introduced me to people that I'd never even heard of before, like Stephen Kerwood and Joshua Bennett and Kendra Pierre Louise. These are people who are now contemporaries that I can apparently collaborate with because they're living today and they're doing the solid work. You know, I think the thing that I love is that you name one person after another and you talk to them for us as if we're talking to them ourselves. You know, and I especially love that you did a great job of assigning everyone, including me. So thank you very much for including my words in this book as well. You know, you assigned all of us into kind of different topic categories. So we talk about spirit, wild, soil, defense. So what can you tell us about the process of, first of all, reaching out to these amazing environmental leaders? And how did you assign us all into the various categories that I think speak very well to the topic of Black Earth wisdom?
Oh, you're so generous. I appreciate that. And I'm glad you mentioned Steve Kerwood. I just got to give him a big shout out because we were on a show together last night. So you see this community is growing. But do you know that when he started living on Earth in 1990, 85% of the public did not even register the notion of global warming? And he proposed a show about it. His producers laughed at him and said, you will run out of stories in 6 months. And the bittersweet reality is that he was clearly right. Like, living on Earth continues to this day. It's among the most popular environmental programs on the radio. So he's an elder who we should know. And actually, I'll admit, I grew up listening to his show and I didn't know he was Black until this project. You just hear a voice on the radio, you don't know one way or the other.
Right.
Wait, living on Earth? Oh, I got to talk to Steve Kerwood. He's been a voice in my ear as a child. So the process was after I was meditating on this story that I mentioned of Dr. Carver talking to God through the trees. I called up one of my elders, Dr. Claudia J. Ford. We call her Mama Claudia. She's an ethnobotanist at SUNY Potsdam. And I said, Mama Claudia, do you talk to plants? She was like, of course I talk to plants. So we got in a whole conversation and then I asked her for some more names. I was like, who else is in the environmental field who shares this perspective? And she dropped some names. So I interviewed them and then they dropped some names. So a lot of the folks that I interviewed was cold calls. I didn't know them before. And we mentioned this offline, but it's a tragic reality that the regenerative farming community is actually quite separate from the environmental community, even though we have so much in common. So, I was meeting new people as well. And I didn't know what was going to come out of the interviews. I was kind of pulling my hair out thinking, how do I take so many beautiful ideas and weave them into something coherent? And so this idea came to me of matching people based on the main themes that emerged in the conversation and grouping them together as if they were in one panel. So I reverse engineered the questions and put people together, and then of course ran it by you all and said, does this sound good? And 99% of folks liked who they were paired with. So I had to make a few changes. And then I wrote some essays and connecting pieces to try to carry the narrative through. But the goal was that we'd all feel like we were in a conference or a salon or, on retreat together, just talking about the things that matter most to us. And as you noted, it certainly does not have all of the Black environmentalists, there's a directory that did not make it to print. It's online at blackearthwisdom.org that has hundreds more people and organizations that, you know, we weren't able to include, but that are just as worthy as the people who were included.
Wow. Well, I want to make sure that we share that list with this audience when the video posts online. In fact, you know, it's definitely something that I would love to include in the, you know, just put in a quick plug, the resource hub at Together Outdoors at togetheroutdoors.com, where we basically talk about the various resources that are available today to become an environmental activist, and most importantly, in your work in outdoor recreation, to become anti-racist, which is critically important. I've got a couple more questions, but before I do, I want to make sure that everyone online has the opportunity to ask our guests questions. So please, a couple of you have already taken advantage of the chat function. So if there's something that you would like to ask or something you'd like to know, please don't hesitate to drop your comments into the chat window. And towards the end of the hour, we'll get hopefully to everyone's question. You know, I think perhaps what I found most interesting, again, is that you talk to so many different people, you know, and I'm sure that I'm not going to ask you to pick your favorite interview, because I'm sure that every conversation
that would be
brought some amazing revelation. But I'm curious to know, was there anything in particular that you found profound, and you know, was perhaps enlightening or inciting to you that you might not have known or realized before you started this book process?
Oh, so many things, but I'll mention one theme that arose. And the first person to bring it to my attention was Audrey Peterman, who's a Jamaican American elder and a lover of the national parks. And incidentally, also one of those people that just radiates joy and light anytime you speak with her. So Mama Audrey was talking about, you know, the first time that she was out in the Great Plains and seeing the night sky unencumbered by light pollution, the sort of dazzling nature contrast of the stars against blackness, and was reflecting on the fact that there was a time in human history when many more of us could read the sky. We could tell directionality, the calendar, the weather. We could read the history of our people and the patterns of the constellations. And as time has gone on, we've become, you know, purportedly more civilized. Fewer people can read the sky. And she sees the sky as a primary source. And in addition to the sky, there are other primary sources that the earth provides for us, right? Lenny Sorensen talks about, you know, there was a time when farmers knew to plant corn when the oak leaves were the size of a squirrel's ear, because that's when the soil was warm enough. And other people brought forth, you know, ice cores and the pH of the oceans and the songs of the birds, the rings of trees. So all of these are primary sources. But Mama Audrey said, you know, as fewer of us are literate, it's kind of like we're playing this game of telephone where one person whispers the messages of the earth to the next, who whispers it to the next. And pretty soon you're at a tertiary, quaternary, you know, message that's quite scrambled. It's quite distorted. And this becomes dangerous because society is determining our direction based on scrambled messages. So if we were to get back on course, that one of the things we'd have to do is relearn the languages of the earth. So more of us are literate. And I just found that such a profound framing, you know, because we talk about a literacy crisis, and of course we mean, you know, printed words on a text, but we have a different kind of literacy crisis in that we don't even, you know, if I lived in a neighborhood my whole life and didn't know the names of my human neighbors, you'd probably think you'd have judgments on my character. And yet here we are in neighborhoods of lizards and fungi and trees and birds, and so many of us can't even call them by name, even having lived beside them for our whole lives. So that's the literacy problem of our time.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why I insist that people read, and books like yours, I think, really give us an opportunity to take people literally at their word and put into context the things that have been able to hopefully guide their lives. Truthfully, I mean, I think one of the things that, you know, I find really interesting about your work is the regenerative nature of it. And I'll keep coming back to that, because I honestly believe that regenerative agriculture essentially is how, you know, we can better frame our place in the world. and you've already taken your particular corner of New York to be able to create a regenerative space. You have people out in the community that are sharing these stories and hopefully encouraging other people to be regenerative in their communities as well. What will it take to get this to scale? I mean, to get it to the point where regenerative agriculture is the standard way of growing food, where we're using cover crops and, making sure that we are, using fewer pesticides, preferably none. How do we make it so that this is how the world produces food again?
Mm-hmm. Right, right. So how do we scale regenerative? And a lot of people will challenge that, is it as productive? Is it this or that? And, it's important to note that, while if you study yields just over a 1-year time period, then, conventional will beat out organic. But as soon as you increase the time scale to 5 or 7 years, you start to see really similar yields. And the reason is that organic and regenerative are more resilient. So they can handle a pest outbreak, a drought, a flooding event because of the diversity, because of the investment in soil, organic matter, and so on. And that's crucial. And then if you add an intercropping component, so instead of monocropping, intercropping, so the famous Haudenosaunee, like corn, beans, and squash, for example, you actually get a 40% higher yield per acre than in a monocropped field. So that's important to understand, because a lot of times our movements and our ways of doing things are dismissed on this productivity lens, which you can argue whether that's even the valid metric, because if you're destroying your water and soil and for the name of productivity, that maybe that's not valid anyway. But we also have to understand that historically it was industrial agriculture that actually catalyzed anthropogenic climate change. So in the mid 1800s, the opening of the Great Plains with the plow destroyed 50% of the soil organic matter. And you can actually see the CO2 in the atmosphere rise in our, historical graphs because of the tilling of the Great Plains. And so, fossil fuels certainly have overtaken that as a source, but agriculture in of itself is a quarter of the problem. So now that we have the facts, like, how do we change behavior? I mean, the real answer to that is we have to uproot racial capitalism, because right now our food system is built on stolen land and exploited labor. And the purpose of our food system is to generate profit. And so as long as you have a profit motivated food system, all of these other values we have just become externalities, right? So really, the real answer is a different economic system. But what is inspiring me in the context of not having overhauled the economic system is that, as we've seen a very slight increase in the number of Black farmers from like 1% to 1.5%. And shout out to all of our intersecting movements for making that possible. And these farmers are leaning regenerative. The Young Farmers Coalition did a survey of the nation's farmers. These farmers are leaning regenerative. And it's not just here, it's globally. We have partners in the Caribbean and in the continent of Africa. And so the desire is there from the people who are closest to the earth. And if we organize ourselves well, we become a force that can't be resisted.
See, and I'm hearing everything that you're saying, and I sincerely believe it. The question, though, is can we get out of that 1-year time cycle? Because we're really only thinking until the next harvest,
Exactly.
as opposed to the next 10 harvests. And I really wish that we could use the science, that shows that we do indeed have greater yields over longer time, and that we can sequester more carbon, that we can reduce CO2 outputs, that we can increase the amount of regenerative soils. I mean, there's so many good reasons to do this, but I think that you succeeded in kind of hitting the nail on the head by saying that our food system is 100% profit driven, as opposed to having it be incentivized to be environmentally protective, and recognizing the values of scale of that. And that gets us to the question of what can we do as people to insist or demand those kinds of outputs that allow us to heal ourselves through the healed earth through regenerative agriculture.
How do we demand it? Okay, so I am going to answer that question, but first I just can't resist saying something about timescale, because the other profound thing that I want to mention that I learned in the Black Earth Wisdom Research Project, this is from talking with Dr. Lorette Savoy, is I thought that we at Soulfire were so progressive because we don't measure our successes and returns in quarterly cycles the way capitalism does. We're thinking generationally, right? As we should. But Lorettes and geologists are thinking on these cosmic timescales,
Right.
like thousands and millions of years.
Right.
And I'll tell you a story about how that relates to our life and why I think, why I think it's relevant to this. So context, we're here on this mountain land. There's almost no topsoil, right? So we get here in 2006, we stick a shovel in the ground, it clinks. There's no way you're going to grow food on that, right? So over the years, we're cover cropping and mulching and composting and rotating the animals through and building soil, right? So fast forward to last year, Tiffany Lachey comes to the farm to teach a soil workshop. She's a Black soil scientist, and she does a soil core. So for folks who don't know, you take an auger, you sort of twist it into the soil, and you come out with this cylinder, and then you do it again and repeat until you have many feet. And as you go deeper, you're actually going further back in time.
Right.
So Tiffany, who knows a lot more about soil than I do, starts reading it. She's like, oh, okay, this is 2,000 years ago. This is when Mohican folks were managing the forest with fire in order to increase the berries and the deer. And then this is the 1800 sheep craze. You can see their manure right here. You're reading on. And then she gets to present day and she goes, and this 1 foot of rich, black, dark humus is what you all built. And this will be recorded permanently in the geological record. Right? Mic drop. Like thousands of years from now, someone will take a soil core and they'll go, these people were here and they contributed something. In contrast, Dr. Lanham said, when thousands of years from now, when somebody, aliens or whoever comes and takes looks at the geologic record, they're going to see plastic and death. Right. And so it got me thinking, like, what if we actually measured the success of our time here on the planet by what is left behind in the rock layer, So to get to your question about how do we demand it? I mean, what do we organize for? On the national level, the Farm Bill is coming up and there are coalitions just organizing our butts off right now, trying to get the Farm Bill to have incentives for regenerative, trying to have provisions for returning land to Indigenous people, making land available for Black and Brown folks, expanding the EQIP program, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and the Resource Conservation Program, so there's that, because right now the Farm Bill controls the food system and it's totally backwards. It subsidizes farmers that trash the earth, and farmers that care for the earth have to go through regulatory hoops to be certified or to get credits. And we just got to flip it. You should have to get a permit to trash the earth, right? So that's
at least pay for it.
Yeah.
I mean, there definitely should be a pollution tax. Well, yeah. I've taken up enough of the hour with my questions. I want to turn it over to our audience. And our first question comes from Nikita Moore. Nikita, can you take your camera, your mic off mute and turn your camera on and ask your question for our guest?
Yes. Okay. Let me look for it. Okay. Well, one, thank you so much. I so appreciate, I'm taking notes over here furiously. So I just so appreciate it. And I'm happy that I'm on the call today. So I actually had a couple of questions, but I'll ask the first one. I'm working with, so I'm a baby to this process. I'm working, I'm a professor at Adler University. I'm teaching a Black psychology class. And in that Black psychology class, we're talking about our relationship as Black people to nature and how to reconnect. And as I have a little garden plot at a community plot, I'm inviting my students out to help me. And they're actually coming out this Saturday to help me get it together. And, in the class, we talked about libations and storytelling and rituals and ceremonies. And I wanted to know if you engaged in rituals or ceremonies with Black people specifically regarding the opening of a farming or gardening that's rooted in our ancestral ways as a way to connect them to what other people are doing in this way, connect them to our ancestors. I want to start them off in a way that is deep and meaningful, that connects them to our ancestors, if you've done anything like that.
Oh, I love that question. And thank you so much for the work you're doing with these young people. There was a recent study of 900 1,000 Americans that showed that young people who grow up deprived of nature have a 55% higher risk of a psychiatric disorder. And quarters of our youth grow up without access to nature. So the fact that you are seeing how nature integrates to Black psychology is brilliant and on time, right? So I thank you for that. As far as what kind of rituals to do, I will say that the other hat that I wear is I'm a member of clergy in traditional West African religion, Orisa worship. And so there's a religion built around nature and the ancestors that our people have practiced for thousands and thousands of years. And I'm very blessed to be a member of clergy. And so there's a whole lot that can be done. We certainly do a lot of rituals, but the simplest one is summarized by my friend, who's also a priest, Onigbana Shangofemi Anrohavkini, who says, give something, say something, listen. So the 3 parts: give something, say something, listen. So you make an offering. You can put down a little bit of cornmeal on the ground, put down some dried herbs, pour some honey onto the ground as a gift for a symbolic gift for the earth. And so that's the give something, making an offering. Then say something, greetings. This is Leah, daughter of Adele and Keith. And I just want to give thanks that I'm here in this beautiful garden where I am delighted by the smell and taste, where I feel the ground firm beneath my feet. And I pray that while I'm here, that I'm in harmony, that I receive answers to the questions in my heart, that I make a contribution, that I use my time here to benefit all beings, right? And then listen, then be quiet and just let the wind do the talking, as Shelton Johnson talks about. Just be quiet and let the wind do the talking, because the earth, as Dr. Carver said, is always speaking if we just quiet down and listen. So of course, there are many complex rituals, and I'm happy to talk offline, but the simplest, give something, say something, listen, is very accessible, and including for young people, and might be worth trying in the garden.
I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Do I have a chance to ask that second question real quick?
Go ahead.
Wait, okay.
No, go ahead.
So the second question I had really quickly was, so I'm actually on the board of the American Indian Center in Chicago, and we're doing food as medicine. And we actually got a plot as well, and we're planting the 3 sisters. And we know that about intercropping, but I'm wondering, do you know of any West African knowledge regarding intercropping as well? Because I've read a book by Richard Peterson, Conversations in the Rainforest, and he talks about very similar notions as well, but I'm wondering, if we can speak on it also from a West African perspective, because once again, from my Black students, they're needing to also hear that connection, as you said earlier. So I'm wondering.
Yes, your questions are giving me the chills. You're making me so happy. Okay, so yes, of course. In Nigeria alone, there's over 100 polycultures, meaning mixed, plants mixed together, that have been documented by Western anthropologists. So I write about this pretty extensively in Farming While Black, but it's also of note that a lot of African crops, they're not native to here. And so I don't know, exactly your geography, but some of them don't grow. So some of those integrations are not relevant. However, shout out to my friend Chris Bolden Newsom, who's a Black farmer at Sankofa Farm in Philadelphia, who is advocating for the 3 sisters as you do, and then the 3 more sisters, spelled M-O, the 3 more sisters, which are sorghum is the tall sister that can grow up, then the vining black-eyed pea. So you could use, for example, the what do they call that really curly one that's cute? I'll give you the name in a second, but it's the vining black-eyed pea. And then on the ground spreading, either gourd, which is the African crop, or using like sweet potato as a stand-in for the yam. So sweet potato is native to this continent, but the Black community has used sweet potato since being forced to this continent in place of our yam, which is our traditional crop, but does not grow well here. So again, the sorghum is from Africa, the black-eyed pea is from Africa, the gourd, and also like bitter melon and other melons are from Africa as well. So anything that's like in the curcubit family that can vine. And so they're doing that with all the Black youth in the gardens, and it's very much resonating. They'll grow it like an indigenous 3 sisters and a Black 3 sisters, and talk about solidarity and talk about commonality. So that, there's a lot of richness in that.
Thank you.
great questions. Thank you so much. Mary C. Anderson, you've got a question. Would you like to unmute your microphone, turn on your camera, and ask our guest?
Okay, yes, thank you very much. And hopefully you can see me. I got to get rid of a little bit of window there. Okay, James and Leah, thank you so much for putting this together. This was an excellent, excellent hour. I appreciate your work. And Lee, for you, how do we overcome the industrial wheel pushback to what I've been working on in my career of about 30 years of managing grass, managing for habitat, watching and listening to what the earth tells us to do? Because even after 30 years, we're still considered, you know, off the wall, we're new vogue, it's never going to last, but we're all still here trying to work this forward.
Well, thank you for your 30 years of work and not giving up. And, you know, in every generation, there have been seed bearers who have refused to give up, and often in the face of things at least as dire as what we're facing. So I think it comes back to that hope piece, but it also comes back to like practical strategizing. You know, James and I were talking about this earlier about the fact that when I started researching for Black Earth Wisdom, none of the people that I had talked to for Farming While Black knew the Black Earth Wisdom people. In other words, the regenerative movement was entirely segregated from the environmental movement, which to me is insane. Like, it's insane that we have not built stronger coalitions and stronger relationships across these very too closely related issue areas. And then if you expand that out, like, why are we not also working with like food advocates and housing justice advocates? Because the underlying issues are the same. We're dealing with a racial capitalism that is more interested in profit than it is in the well-being of anything that breathes. And if we can focus on those underlying issues, we start to see that we actually have a lot more in common. And it's not about like, no, climate is more important, no, water is more important, no, like schools are more important. They're all important and they're all connected, because we want a society that values life, that values the, you know, intrinsic right to life. And so I think on a strategic level, it's about coalition building, and we have, you know, a lot to learn. You know, they assassinated our leaders in the 60s and 70s. So we're relearning our political framework and relearning our praxis. And, you know, we have a lot that we can take in from Via Campesina and other international indigenous movements that understand what it is to organize across difference and pull people together so that we're strong enough, you know, to push back against these industrial forces.
Thank you. And it's also nice for me to know that I'm not the only one who listens to the trees.
Yay.
Well, just so that we can keep the conversation going, Lynn Pearson, one of our stalwarts, regular attendees, is having difficulties with her camera, but she has a question about books that you might be able to recommend for young people in particular. Do you have specific suggestions or have suggestions for good references that can help young people learn about these important issues about farming and regenerative agriculture? Thanks, Lynn.
Oh, that's so good. I wish I had a better answer for this children's book. I have a nice directory of adults books, but I know there is one on Harriet Tubman's Orchard. I can't think of what it's called, and I don't want to hear the clanking of my type, but if you look up, there's a children's book on exactly what I was saying about Harriet Tubman's yearning for an orchard. And there's also a really good one about Dr. Carver. So I would start there, but I'll also say I owe you one because I should have an outstanding book list. I'm going to look at you, James, and put you on the spot. Do you have some suggested children's books?
Oh my gosh, I wish I did. And Lynn is always asking for children's books because that's the world that she occupies. And I try to be as supportive as I can for her regarding this. So Lynn, I will make it a point to try to find some references for you in the coming days, because truthfully, I think that being able to make these references available to young people at an early age makes it so much easier to turn them into conscientious adults. I got just one last question for you, Lynn, and then we're going to, Leah, and then we're going to close our hour out. If there's any one thing that you want your readers to come away with having learned from having read your book, what would it be?
If there's one thing that readers came away with, it would be to Understand that the scientific method has a complement, which is the Afro-Indigenous Earth Listening Framework. And I distilled from all of these like 40 interviews and many, many, many hours of conversation, these 3 basic habits of mind that all of the contributors had. And these 3 habits of mind are: 1, reading the earth as a text; 2, loving the earth as kin; and 3, emulating the earth as teacher. And so earth as text, earth as kin, earth as teacher is both ancient and futuristic, right? Just like the scientific method, an old idea, but it's a framework that we use to make decisions about what new information to add to our canon. This Afro-Indigenous framework of earth, reading the earth, loving the earth, emulating the earth, becomes a barometer against which we can evaluate our ecological direction. So that is my hope as to what people take away.
Thank you so much, not only for your work, but for sharing your time with us this evening. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed this book. As I'm thinking about it, I'm getting goosebumps. If you have not done the reading, and I insist that you do, please take the time to read Black Earth Wisdom. It's an amazing title. Our partner, the University of Wisconsin Bookstore, is adding it to its publication list. So you will be able to purchase copies there, or you can get them online or directly through Leah's website, which will be posted on the Joyce Project website with this video. I'd like to close the hour out in respect of everyone's time by saying that author discussions on the Joyce Projects are made possible thanks to the support of the Schleck Family Foundation, the National Geographic Society, the National Park Service, in partnership with Together Outdoors and the University of Wisconsin-Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. Thank you so much for taking the time to visit with us. And our title for next month, coming up towards the end of May, the title is Camp Stories Volume 2, which is a wonderful story about national parks and trails and stories to tell around the campfire with my good friends, David and Aaliyah Q. So please look for an update on the Joyce Project website for that listing, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Until then, take care and enjoy the rest of your evening.